Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we are pro-individual and pro-freedom. This is episode 69, and we're going to talk about Lao Tzu and the Daodejing, which is what he is said to have written. We're going to talk about bad government and the beauty of the boring life. So first, I want to point out that I have exceeded my storage limit for my hosting site. And so some of you won't be able to, like on Rumble and YouTube, you'll be able to hear this on Thursday. However, if you listen to this anywhere else, you won't hear it until Friday, once we enter into September. So sorry about that. I probably have to make my podcast shorter so I don't have this kind of snafu once again. I think what also messed me up is uploading some of the old episodes that I had skipped in that very first month, and then that pushed me over. But anyway, so Lao Tzu, and you pronounce it Lao Tzu. That's the way best my approximation of it. I don't speak Chinese, but Zi is not his last name. It's his title. Like in English, we say Sir Richard, and that comes first. The title comes first, as Sir Richard. But in Asia, the name comes first, and any kind of title comes after the name. So Lao Tzu, so Lao Tzu. Confucius, the way you would pronounce it in Chinese, I guess, is Gong Tzu, right? So, and even in the Korean language, you say Gongja, right? So there's that. Anyway, so it's the Lao Tzu, supposedly the author of the Daodejing. It was written so long ago, people don't really know for sure. But anyway, the religion of Taoism is based on the writing of the Daodejing. So Lao Tzu was apparently a disillusioned, jaded government employee, and he quit. And he just got so frustrated and fed up with everything, he just wanted to disappear. But before he did, someone recognized him and would not let him go until he wrote down all of his wisdom. I guess he was known to be a wise person. And so if you read the Daodejing, it's very much like poetry. If you're familiar with scripture, it reads a lot like Psalms, except it's not very Western in its thinking. Not that scripture is either. I mean, it's Middle East, and that counts as Asia, right? But I give you an example. One line, he pushes and promotes actionless action, action that has no action. Another expression that is very much associated with the Daodejing would be go with the flow, and that is feng shui, right? And some of you may have encountered that terminology when it comes to the flow of energy through the world and in life. And in America anyway, most people encounter feng shui when it comes to arranging the furniture in your house, interestingly enough. And the religion that is based on the Daodejing or Taoism would be the Falun Gong, which is currently being heavily persecuted by the Chinese government because it is not officially recognized as a real religion. But we talked about this before in another episode, that what is religion anyway? System of belief. And so many of the Asian philosophies, it was debated throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s whether they count as religion or not. And the answer was, sure, why not? It's philosophy, it's literature, and it can be religion as well. So one thing I want to point out is that as I go through some of the excerpts of the Daodejing and Lao Tzu and his description of bad government, you'll notice that there's a lot of elements which sound very similar to Christianity and libertarianism. And it might be because of the way that I interpret the lines, but I think it's undeniable that given the translation, if the translation into English, because again, I don't know Chinese, if the interpretation translation is accurate, then definitely he's not a big fan of government. I will insert here that Taoism, some say, is a reactionary philosophy to Confucianism. So Confucianism is very hierarchical, very top down. One might even be tempted to say authoritarian, but because there's a hierarchical structure and the way that it views a proper functioning society is that everything is top down. You have a leader, and the leader then tells everyone else how they're supposed to live, because the leader is the wisest of all. But then if you look closely, especially, people who want to abuse a lot of the authority, which is very natural to humans in general, and we've talked about that before as well, that it lends itself, the philosophy lends itself to all manner of abuse. And so Westerners, particularly when they look at Asian society, Asian culture, they have lots of critiques, because Western society generally is egalitarian, not hierarchical. And so a lot of the critique comes from that subjectivity. What's right and what's wrong obviously depends on your subjectivity. But Taoism, Daodejing, this pushes against all of the structure of Confucianism. And so it's a very, go with the flow. If it's right, if it's the best, if it's what goes with the flow, then that's what you do. Sometimes it's not what hierarchy thinks is the right way to go, right? So there's a resistance, there's a sort of pushback against the rigid structure of Confucianism. But because you can have a strong corrupt government through Confucianism, most governments adopt the teachings of Confucius, not Lao Tzu, okay? It's sort of like even in the West, where libertarianism is hated, often called and identified as right-wing, when all it is pro-freedom. And obviously, the status quo, who enjoys the benefits of a corrupt government, of course, will put down and try to demonize anything which promotes freedom, especially in days like these. In any case, so I'm just going to touch on some of the chapters, some of the lines from some of the chapters that kind of bring out this go with the flow, anti-authoritarian sort of mindset that you can find in the Daodejing. And again, I'm going to try to keep the episodes a little bit shorter. So I'll just give you enough that when you go through and actually try to read the Daodejing, if you ever do, then you can kind of have an orientation in terms of how you might want to understand the lines of the chapters. And the chapters are very brief. They go up to chapter 81, I believe. But the chapters, again, they're like very short poems. They're like Psalms. If you're familiar with Christian Hebrew scripture, Old Testament and Christian world, they're very much like the poems in the Psalms. Okay. So in chapter 3, you see he talks about acting naturally without desire. How do you act without desire is always a question I get in class, right? You desire for things, you need things, you want things, and therefore that then prompts action. And so one thing that you have to realize is that what you begin to realize is that in the Daodejing, desire is what is not Tao. And the Tao is the way, right? And so Daodejing, Dao, way, de is virtuousness, right? So the way of virtue, okay. So when you are living in the way, you are not living by desire. And what the way would be is the proper way to live. So if you're living according to good moral structure, then there's no desire, because you're doing what is right, and that should be what comes naturally. Then there are other people who come along and say, nope, I don't want to do that. It's too boring. Everyone else is doing that. I want to do this. So a lot of people have a hard time trying to get their heads around that. But imagine saying that you want to help the environment of the world, you want to fight climate change, but you do nothing to end wars in the world. Well, then that just is contradiction. That is desire, right? You want to make the planet green. At the same time, you want to fight evil in the world by blowing up a lot of people, a lot of infrastructure, whatever, in the Western way. See, that's an impossible situation. That is living by desire, right? And so desire means that if you want to be an environmentalist, then you have to be pro-peace. So chapter 8, we see, quote, a person of great virtue is like flowing water. This imagery of water is very strong in Lao Tzu, also in Sun Tzu, right, in the art of war. We talked about that as well before. But water, imagine water flowing down the side of a mountain. It's going to get to the bottom one way or another. You may try to dam up a stream, sort of block the path of the water, but eventually it's going to find its way around. So water adapts, it's beneficial, it is good, and that is what most represents the Tao. So even when water floods, breaks a dam and then floods the plain or something like that, well, the dam was unnatural to begin with. And so it is that human desire to subvert, divert the way, right, the flow of water, that we create many, many problems in life. And I just want to note that an old student of mine who is like a career Army guy, coming out and transitioning into civilian life, he found a lot of peace in the Tao. And so he combined, and I think subconsciously, he saw a lot of connection with, consciously or unconsciously, he saw a lot of connection with his Christian faith, his Catholic faith, and the Tao. In other words, I suspect that the Tao helped him to make sense of Scripture beyond the church, beyond what the church would teach, right? So I thought that was kind of interesting. Chapter 13, the trusted ruler is the one who values the world as much as himself. One might be able to make the argument that a lot of politicians today only care about themselves, and there is nothing else, right? I mean, you can just, and things are getting kind of crazy. I think we're reaching peak crazy when so many congressmen, people who work in Congress, have no control over their body or their mind. I saw a video of Mitch McConnell, where his brain just sort of shuts down again. My wife sees it as those mini strokes. There's a technical medical term for it, that he's experiencing strokes on the podium, and all these other people keep pushing him to stay in office. It's just absurd. Dianne Feinstein doesn't have any control over her wits anymore. Pelosi makes casts the votes for her. I mean, she's not even doing anything. Then you got Fetterman from Pennsylvania, who had a major stroke, can't really communicate or even function. And of course, Joe Biden, who severely suffers from dementia. I mean, he's just not there anymore. And so it's just a very interesting thing, right? That there are so many people who value only themselves and go through the motions of caring for the world and for the country. It's a travesty. I cannot believe that we're living in this kind of world. Truly, America has become a banana republic, not only because of the near hyperinflation, on the brink of hyperinflation, but using the power of the justice system to go after political opponents, branding them enemies of the state. It's absurd. It's just crazy how the United States has gotten this low and degenerate and backwards. It's just amazing to me. And on that note, He who is ignorant of nature's law shall act recklessly and thus will invite misfortune, right? So ignoring what is justice, ignoring what is moral, leads to hypocrisy, which then leads to recklessness, which will also result in the downfall of that country. Chapter 18, when the great Tao declines, virtue of humanity and righteousness shall arise. When knowledge and intelligence appear, great hypocrisy shall arise. When a country is in chaos, the loyal officials shall appear. Now, I don't know how you read this, but to me, what I think is kind of interesting is that the great Tao is supposed to be the way. This is the way, the natural course of the way things should be. So when that declines, virtue of humanity will arise, which basically is supposed to, in my mind, mean that virtue of humanity is not really virtue because it's not in line with the great Tao. And so knowledge and intelligence appear, that's when hypocrisy arises, right? Because the knowledge and intelligence is fake. It's not real. It's disinformation, right? And many people today in the university and in politics keep spewing a lot of information, but then why do all of the problems get worse? Why does the hypocrisy increase? So all of their political opponents do minor things, they go to prison, but they do horrible things and they're free. It's pretty interesting, right? When a country is in chaos, loyal officials appear, right? Well, the loyal officials are the ones that are maintaining that chaos. Let's see, chapter 26, how can a ruler govern a nation without recklessness if he indulges in power and desire? So leaders can't have power and desire, but those people who don't want power and desire are not in politics, right? They are not seeking the positions which govern a nation. And so who are we left with? We're left with people who want power, right? And so, of course, the country will be in decline. Chapter 30, I thought was kind of interesting. After a war is fought, bad years are sure to follow. Why? Because everyone's dead. All of the workers are dead. The farmland is burned up. There's no food for a couple of years. And then if all of the soldiers are dead, then who's going to farm that land? So bad years are sure to follow. Chapter 38, a man of superior virtue is not conscious of being virtuous, hence is truly virtuous. You know, sort of like Socrates. You know, it's like, I'm not wise. I'll prove it. Look at all these other people who are supposed to be wise. Oh, wait, they're not wise either. So a person who doesn't think of themselves as virtuous is probably the person who actually is virtuous. And then he says, a man of inferior virtue performs for the purpose of virtue. Hence, he is not virtuous. And that's the whole virtue signaling phenomena that we see today, right? People chasing and saying, look, I'm doing this awesome thing. Look at give me some likes or whatever. But of course, that's not real virtue, because once the camera is off, then they're doing all kinds of horrible things. The more prohibitions, chapter 57, the more prohibitions that are imposed on people, the poorer the people become. The more laws and regulation that exists, the more thieves and brigands appear, criminals, right? Of course, because everything, all freedom of choice, all the choices that we want to make has been criminalized. And we discussed this early on. The legislation of morality does not change people's behavior. You just criminalize all of the things people are going to still do, no matter if it's illegal or not. And so that is a very, very serious problem. So if you want a poor country, just heap on those laws, keep saying that the solution for our problems that we have now are more laws, then we'll become more poor. Chapter 58, when the government is dull, people are simple and sincere. When the government is complex and stringent, people are cunning and shall cause trouble. This is sort of building on what we just said. When the government is totally ineffective, they can do nothing, then people are pretty cool, right? They're simple, life is simple and honest, we can care for each other. But when the government is huge and complex, that's when people become all manner of shady, taking advantage of government programs, entering into moral hazards, where the government makes really bad choices seem awesome, so more people do it. Chapter 60, ruling a nation is like frying a small fish. Don't overdo it, right? And so basically, most politicians keep fussing with the laws, with life, with just individual happiness, and so they are ruining the country. Chapter 61, a great nation rules by placing itself in a lowly position, like the ocean. Small and great nation, small and great nation have positive relationships. And so what is it to put yourself in a lowly position? You are serving other countries. And this is, if you go back to Say's law, right? The only way that you can have wealth, have anything to trade with other people, to have more stuff, is you have to serve the interests of others, not like the way the US is doing it right now by trying to rule over everyone and telling everyone what they're supposed to do. Okay, so that's, I think, a pretty good sampling of some of the passages from the Daodejing. Going with the flow is better than chasing excitement and finding something to complain about, right? So if you go on X or Twitter these days, the only way you generate interest and interaction is you got to be controversial. You got to say things which will invite misinterpretation and thus outrage. And that's pretty much the way people are now. And in total contrast with that is just go with the flow. The beauty of living a boring life, a life that no one really, other people don't care about. But the person who lives this boring life is content because they're living life morally, just with justice, free from hypocrisy, free from authoritarianism, free from any kind of coercion. And in this way, we seek out what is best, and we discard and give up on things which are not working, wasteful, obsolete. And so our lives are continually moving forward, developing, improving, advancing. And in this way, we can achieve a higher level of satisfaction and, above all, joy. Well, that's it for this episode. I'll talk to you in the next.